Alrighty, hello U.S. history students. We are going to be talking about the Federalist period, specifically the first two presidents. Whoa, slides are excited to get going. The first two presidents, George Washington and John Adams. So, kind of the beginning, the bumpy start to the United States, because a lot of times we study the Revolution, we study the Declaration of Independence, even the colonies, and then we think, oh, now we have a country, and that's nice. Now we have a country without appreciating the kind of how difficult that was and what a rocky start and the dangers that imperiled the nation in those first decades. So in that period, that's made up of the first two presidents, Washington and Adams. That's known as the Federalist period. So make sure you have your outline, and we got three sections here, starting with the pre-presidency and then going over those two presidencies. So first, we talk about our first form of government, which we no longer have, and that was the Articles of Confederation. So we kind of talked about this more last week, so I'll go quickly here. But it's important to remember that, again, our first try didn't work. We thought, hey, we have a nation. How should we come together? And it was too weak. However, two of its accomplishments, things that it did achieve, the first government, was one, the Treaty of Paris in 1783. That 1783 is the end date of the American or the War for Independence. So that was the official treaty that ended the war. It ratified or signified official nationhood. We became a nation in 1783, and that included the Northwest Territory. So not only did we get the 13 colonies, or the United States get the 13 colonies after the war, but you can see all the green, all the territory between south of the Great Lakes and east of the Mississippi River were part of the newly established United States. And that was all worked out by the government under the Articles of Confederation. So well done. You can also see then the other national uh, nations vying for the other territories, Spain and England, um, following the revolution, and how that was distributed here in this map. Okay, second accomplishment of the Articles of Confederation was something called the Northwest Ordinance, and that was simply directions for how to manage that new territory beyond the 13 colonies, and how that could be divided up, what would be the priorities there, and how would they become states. And so just the benefits of it is it's a very beautifully and elegantly written piece of legislation. Today, laws are thousands and thousands and thousands of pages long. This was just in the tens of pages, and it provided a clear path to expansion, a clear path to statehood. It went through the process of how a territory could become a state by setting up a government, setting up a constitution, and then applying, and how the vote would have to take place for that to happen. It set up income that would come from the selling of land, how they would then sell off the land of the Northwest Territory to fund the government. And it also, within the directions for how to set up these new states and territories, there was direction on how to support, how they have to set up schools and how they need to support education and religion in the new territories, which again proved beneficial for the continual educational, spiritual, moral development of the American people, even in the frontier areas, as the nation expanded. So the Northwest Ordinance and also the Treaty of Paris, two major accomplishments. However, its weaknesses were so abundant that eventually the articles would not last. As we talked about, number one, it had no way to collect taxes. It relied on the states to supply the taxes, and the states were not quick and zealous about doing that. So if you couldn't collect taxes, it couldn't pay debts. And if you can't incur debts or spend money, then you can't really function. And so the government basically couldn't function because it had very little funding. Also, it was hard to carry out anything it did pass because it had no executive to carry out the laws, or to lead. They could pass a law and then say, okay, we expect the governors and the various people within the states to follow this. There was nobody to make sure it happened. There was no judiciary to deal with international issues or interstate issues, kind of to arbitrate between those things. It was also no to judge whether the laws were constitutional or not. And again, there was not a lot of regulation of commerce, and I would include in that foreign policy. So there seemed to be a lot of competition between the states under the Articles of Confederation, even vying with one another for attention from foreign powers. And so they very much were like 13 independent states or nations under the Articles, and then kind of loosely kind of working together, almost like the European Union today. And again, that just did not function very well at all for all those reasons. The two big examples of the unrest during the Articles of Confederation were the Shays Rebellion, in which Massachusetts frontiersmen or farmers revolted when new taxes were levied by the state. They saw that as a repeat of various forms of tyranny. As under the British, they become very sensitive to any form of taxation and impingement on their rights. Um, and so they revolted, though they were eventually able to be put down when the militias came against them. But it was a quick sign that while the insurrection had aided the breaking from Britain and the forming of a new nation, there was no reason that all of a sudden that insurrection was going to end when the new American governments tried to implement authority. And again, the government under the Articles of Confederation was not strong enough to respond and put down these issues. Another conspiracy threatening the early nation was known as the Newburgh Conspiracy. And this was a conspiracy of ex army soldiers or officers who were supposed to receive pay and pensions. Again, because of the inability of the federal government to pay its debts, they weren't being paid. And so they sought to do basically a military overthrow of the fledgling republic. And they were going to, again, from the very beginning, the nation was almost overthrown by the military, and it was only saved kind of in the last minute by George Washington himself, who went and pleaded with this Congress of ex-military officers ready to revolt and basically talk them out of it. This quote is something, a famous moment where he went to make his appeal before the officers to stand down. And it wasn't so much what he said, but it was said that this moment where he stood before them and he went to read what he'd written, and he had all of a sudden pull out glasses because his vision was failing with his age. That again, the loyalty and the sense of sacrifice and the example of Washington as a unifier really struck the men, and they were moved by seeing, again, looking at him as a leader, his sense of self-sacrifice, that they couldn't bring themselves to carry out the coup, and so they disbanded. But again, the threats to the national unity and the federal government under the Articles were very strong, and it was very apparent that they needed a new constitution following these events. Okay, so this lecture doesn't get into the writing of the Constitution, but then under it, in 1789, George Washington is inaugurated as the first president of the United States, not under the Articles of Confederation, but the new U.S. Constitution. And a key aspect of George Washington, we're on to our second point now, was all of the precedents, not presidents, but the precedents that he set. He was the first president, in some ways, kind of the first national president in history. Nobody even knew what that meant. What would he look like? Was he a monarch? Was he more like a governor? Was he more like a mayor? Was he more of a figurehead? Nobody really knew. They knew what was in the Constitution, but they didn't see what you write on paper and what a man or person actually does when they have power are two different things. But Washington was a great way to kick things off. And he started the precedent of, first of all, of having a cabinet, not where he put his dishes, but no, a cabinet of advisors who would serve him within the executive branch, so that it wasn't just him ruling, but that he had a group of advisors who helped him regulate various aspects, like the Secretary of State or the Secretary of the Treasury, different aspects of the federal government. He also, probably the most important precedent he set was the two-term presidency. There was nothing in the Constitution that kept him from running a third, fourth, fifth time. Obviously, he was getting older, but he was reelected once and said, "I will not run again," even though he would have again been unanimously elected probably. And that was a precedent held until Franklin Delano Roosevelt following during World War II. Again, only then does it later become part of a constitutional amendment requiring a president only to run no more than 2 terms. But before that, they were all of the presidents were following the example of Washington and not daring to run for a 3rd term. He started the president of a State of the Union address given at the beginning of each year, kind of addressing Congress, standing before Congress and being accountable to Congress. Actually, it's an act of being accountable to explain how the nation's doing. It's actually a sign of Congress's authority that the president would come before them and address them. The emergence of presidential parties. These aren't like political parties, but just that he threw events, and that they would have people over to the mansion, and that people could socialize and meet him, and that he would be a social figure as well as a government, a government employee. small one, but also significant. He took the oath of office upon the Bible, and he added the words "So help me God," repeated by every president since him. The title of Mr. President, not Your Highness, not Your Excellency, not anything higher affluent, or not affluent, but again, over the top, because he just said, no, the president is another citizen of the United States to be addressed with Mr. And also, he gave a famous farewell address, and that has since become something that every president has done. When they are leaving office for the final time, they address the nation and kind of speak into what they believe to be their most important accomplishments and the most important lessons for the next incoming administration. One of the most important issues that came to fore during his presidency was something called the Jay Treaty. Sorry, that says Jay Treaty. It should be the Jay Treaty. And this was basically, there was a war. The big crisis that the U.S. faced after its nationhood was that Britain and France remained at war, and each one wanted the Americans on their side. And the British responded to this by attacking or taking American ships and forcing their American sailors to join the British Navy. And kind of some people thought that was an act of war and that the U.S. should go to war against the British. Washington had a policy of strict neutrality. He did not want to join either side. He wanted to be at peace and trade with both nations. He wanted to stay out of European conflicts because he knew America was too new and too weak to get dragged into that. The Jay Treaty basically kept the peace with England. And stated that neutrality, but also, gave some concessions to England. And again, Washington was extremely unpopular for making this treaty with Britain, who in the American public, or many in the American public at the time, were angry at the impressment of the sailors and wanted to go to war. But Washington, I think, in good judgment, said, we're not ready for that. It's not the right step. We just got out of it. And so he steered this course of neutrality with foreign nations. And also kind of today, it's the beginning of this special relationship with Britain that obviously eventually Britain would become an American ally, even though we were, of course, enemies during the Revolution. Another key challenge to Washington's, I keep having to move my picture here, during Washington's presidency was not the foreign issue of Britain and France, but then this thing called the Whiskey Rebellion, in which Pennsylvania distillers revolted over another tax, similar to Shays' Rebellion. There's still a deep inbred hostility towards government oppression, or even just basic taxation, and so they sought to lead a revolt. And again, it kind of started that same question: would the new government, would the new president, would they be strong enough and wield the authority of a government to put down these insurrections, or would there always be anarchy in the farms and streets of the United States? And we know, would we be too democratic, in which anytime any sort of authority or law was tried, or tax was tried to be implemented, there'd always be an open revolt? Well, Washington set the precedent of, no, I'm the commander in chief. He marched out with the army to put down the rebellion. Those participating, as soon as they heard that he was marching out, they disbanded. There was no open fighting. But again, it set a clear example that the new federal government was stronger than the Articles of Confederation, and that general revolts against lawful taxation, lawful authority, as delineated in the Constitution by the government, would be enforced by law. And George Washington said, we must distinguish between oppression, which is what they would say they fought against Britain, in which the authorities yield power without concern for limitations or what the Constitution says, and, as he says here, the necessary exercise of lawful authority. Again, the delicate balance of the United States between freedom and authority. And Washington, in putting down the Whiskey Rebellion, tried to toe that line. He's basically coming down on the side of there is such a thing as lawful authority, and the need to punish and bring order those in revolt. It's also under Washington that you get, I'll put my face right up here with these guys. Hi, guys. You get the beginning of political parties as we know it. Today we have Democrats and Republicans as the two primary parties. Back then, what emerged was a group called the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. They were kind of shorthand called Republicans, but we call them Democratic Republicans to differentiate them from the modern day Republicans. And you can see, probably you could sum it up as a conflict over strong central government versus strong states' rights. Or, the Federalists favored more authority and the need to hold the nation together. They thought you should then have a national bank. That government should be able to spend lots of money and go into debt. They should be able to broadly interpret extra powers into the Constitution so that they could carry out these greater acts. They were largely pro-British. They were modeling a lot of the things they were doing on the British model, even though they'd broken away. Again, they were kind of the group that said, no, well, it's only because King George became a tyrant. We actually really appreciated the way the British government and economy were run. And so they were still kind of that mind. They were largely associated on the Atlantic coast and in New England. Washington was a Federalist. John Adams, his successor and vice president, was a Federalist, and so was Alexander Hamilton, who famously promoted the National Bank and also the National Army. The Democratic Republicans just put the opposite of everything I just said. I won't go through it detail by detail, except that they saw more of an inspiration in the French Revolution, which was kind of a bottom-up, fully democratic, totally egalitarian, much more favor of they wanted the states' rights, individual rights. They wanted the Constitution strictly interpreted because they didn't want any extra powers, any extra abilities to be given to the federal government should that somehow violate the inalienable freedoms of people. And they were largely more in the South, where there was less population, more rural, as well as then the western frontiers. And Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were strong adherents of that movement in the beginning. Just politics were from the very beginning. Sometimes, again, I was saying this in one of the classes the other day, people act like, oh man, our politics today are so broken and they say such nasty things and they're just at each other's throats. Sorry, that's human nature. It's been that way from the beginning. And we've got two quotes here. The Federalists, how they painted their opponents. Under Democrat rule, we should expect to be dwelling in flames, hoary aged hairs bathed in blood, children writhing on the pike and halberd spears. That's how they depicted what would happen if the Democratic Republican candidate won during the first election. Then Thomas Jefferson, responding back to the Federalists, he said their rule would result in a reign of witches. So the rhetoric, the fear, even the violence at times is nothing new. And again, that it's always good to put what's going on in our current situation in perspective. It's always been a battle for power. And the real genius of this early period was finding the balance so that the two sides in their conflict basically balanced each other out and kept nobody from gaining too much power because they were each competing for it. The writers of the Constitution wouldn't have been too surprised by this. They planned the system to work with the two sides competing against one another. It actually helps keep us free. Oops, I think we went back one too many. Okay, so last thing for Washington, his farewell address. We'll be reading this in class, but it's worth noting because he summarizes what he thought after his 8 years of service, launching the nation into its first transition of power from one president to another, what was the most important things to remember. He said, we need to be neutral. He said, don't pick sides outside of American borders. Work with whoever is working with the best interests of the United States. He definitely, I think, would have had kind of an America first mindset. He said, avoid political factions. So despite what I just said about the benefit of two parties fighting it out and balancing each other for power, Washington hated that. He really thought it was a great evil for the rise of political factions, and was disheartened to see the country kind of splitting, and even the founding fathers splitting into those two sides and beginning to vie for power. He emphasized the need for public morality. He said, you're not going to be able to govern a free people if the individual people in their hearts and their consciences and their behavior is not moral. He, again, in kind of the spirit of the Whiskey Rebellion, he said, if you want change, you need to do it politically. You need to do it peacefully. You don't like what's happening in your country. There is a process to change that. Don't resort to arms. Don't resort to anarchy. Don't resort to violence to make it happen. And he emphasized the need for humble leaders, that leadership, they're meant to be public servants. They exist to make the life better and to maintain the freedoms of all of the citizens, and that they needed to represent humility, not the prideful power, the pride that comes with power, and seeks more of it. And so then we just had that momentous time in which the first transfer of power. And last point, we get into John Adams, and just the election of John Adams in general is a great historical moment because Washington lays down his power. He leaves after 2 terms voluntarily. He could have run for a third, and then they have a peaceful transfer of power to John Adams. And King George at that moment, back in England, said that George Washington was the greatest man on earth for laying down that power. And that America was greatly admired for its ability to transition between rulers peacefully. That they weren't used to that happening. It was used to be the hereditary transfer among just the rich. But no, this was an election by the people. And so we get John Adams. Standing out, one of the first crises that John Adams faced, he still inherits the same conflict of France versus Britain. They're still at war with each other following the French Revolution, and he falls into a situation called the XYZ affair, in which, again, American ships were being captured by both the British but also the French, and he sent an envoy to France to try to negotiate with the French to get back to end this piracy of American ships. But rather than be treated like a legitimate foreign power, and an ambassador, the French basically said, ask for a bribe. They said, you want to talk to us, you want to seek peace or negotiations, you're going to have to send us $250,000 and give us a $10 million loan. Adam, of course, refused that. He said that we're a sovereign government. We don't deal with bribes. And so then there were three French officials who asked for these bribes, and they were codenamed X, Y, and Z because they didn't release their names. But Adams did release the dispatches from France demanding these bribes and the extortion, and it greatly angered the American people, the public, and they began to clamor for war. They were very offended. First, the public opinion was against the British because of their impressment of sailors, but after the XYZ papers, it turned strongly against France, and there was a huge clamor among the American people for war with France. That in and of itself shows you the founders' fear of democracy, because how quickly public sentiments can shift back and forth. No, let's fight Britain. No, let's fight France, based on new information. And they checked the power of the majority and limited the amount of pure democracy in the United States for that very reason. Adams refuses to go to war. He spent much of his 4-year term keeping the United States out of a war with France, even though his party, the Federalists, were very much in favor of the war, because some might have thought it justified. Others saw war as a great way to solidify their power and popularity within the United States. Because, hey, the people want war. Let's give them what they want, and they'll love us for it and reelect us for it. However, Adams refused, because he, like Washington, said, we're going to maintain neutrality, and we're not going to be drawn into an unnecessary war that will destroy our baby country. One act Adams commits, though, during this tension with France is Congress passes the law, but he agrees to sign the Aliens and Sedition Act, considered his most notorious act as president, because it wasn't a time of war, but it was definitely a time of headed towards war. And what the Alien Sedition Act gave the government the power to remove aliens or non-citizens from the country if they were deemed a national security threat, namely targeting French citizens French visitors at the time, and also seditions, in that anybody who published anything negative about the government could be punished, kind of basically smashing or quashing dissent. So this was seen as an attack on free speech. And actually, frankly, was unconstitutional. And so Adams didn't gain the popularity of going to war with France, and then became very unpopular by signing the Aliens and Sedition Act and seeming to attack the freedoms of speech. He began to be called a monarchist, and that he was going to try to make himself king. Oh, that was silly, but that was he never intended that. But again, that was an easy criticism aimed at him after he signed this legislation. Kind of Adams' last legacy, besides the XYZ and the Aliens and Sedition Act, is that he actually loses. He's our first one-term president. Washington gets his 2 terms. Adams, very unpopular, doesn't go to war, doesn't gain from that, and signs Alien and Sedition Act. And so he loses the 1800 election to Thomas Jefferson, who was, again, the head of the opposing Democratic Republican Party. And so Adams' last legacy, besides keeping the U.S. out of war, was to quickly, right before he left office, appoint several Federalists to the federal judiciary and the Supreme Court. It's the president who gets to appoint those, and so it's kind of his last act was to put pro-Federalists or judges who thought the same way as him onto the courts. Interesting. That's what's going on right now at the time of making of this video with Amy Coney Barrett. That's how the Constitution works, and it's been controversial from the very beginning, because they're called the midnight appointments. because Adam does this at the very last moment before leaving office, before Jefferson comes in, just kind of in a way not sneaks in the judges, but that's how it was interpreted by the other party. We're going to talk about this more next week, but Jefferson resists letting these judges who just barely got their paperwork in actually take office because he disagrees with their judicial philosophy. And this is going to lead to one of the most famous Supreme Court cases of the early nation, Marbury versus Madison. But I'll leave discussing that to another time. So we have Adams there on the left of the Federalists, and Thomas Jefferson, his successor, who was going to come in 1800, the start of the new century, and also the first non-Federalist president. And so that's why he will be part of our next section. Okay, so what? Appreciate you tuning in here. So what about the Federalist period? Early critical period for the U.S. Almost got drawn into two wars, one on each side. Almost fell victim to insurrections by its own citizens. Huge debates over state versus federal powers. You know, how it's like the Constitution was this new machine or engine that was designed and planned out, but had never been used. And they turned it on and they had to see, okay, how's this thing actually going to work? What power should actually be exercised? We have the emergence of political parties. Very naturally fell into these two categories, and they've shifted over the time. But we've always kind of had within the United States basically the two power centers and 2 points of view balancing each other out. First being the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. We had the emergence of national foreign policy. How is the U.S. going to deal with wars in Europe? How's the U.S. going to deal when foreign nations begin to attack our sailors overseas, just trying to trade? Which side will we pick? How will we remain neutral? None of this had ever been fleshed out before, and it was Washington and Adams who got first shot at it. There was the argument over, are we a republic or a democracy? That was kind of the first argument between the political parties. Is it a rule of the representatives, and kind of staying, the wise few, or is it pure democracy where everyone gets involved and everyone should have the right to vote and everyone should be able to wield power directly? That's going to be an ongoing discussion into next week. And then, of course, the importance of the character of public officials, that through this time of crisis, the character of men like Washington and Adams and even Jefferson really showed the need to have, again, Adams surrendered his career, his popularity, his second term in order to kind of steer a more neutral course within the wars with France and the debates of the time. And he lost re-election over it. But he said, his idea was, I'm going to do what's best for the country, not what's best for my particular party, the Federalists. Washington, the same way, his character being shown in that he did not want to run for a third office. He wanted to make sure he lived to pass the power peacefully, according to the Constitution, to the next person. So it's always important to remember that, again, the Constitution, a lot of the founding fathers said, was made for a moral people. And that without the self-governing of moral individuals, there's a lot of play and a lot of room for corruption and destruction within the Constitution itself. Luckily, the character has often carried us through. All right, we'll be talking about some of this in class. Appreciate your attention and see you soon.